Georgia's housing market is one that has boomed over the last several years, but could we be now on the precipice of a crash? Because home prices in Georgia, they're pretty overvalued compared to their long-term norms. With Georgia's home price overvaluation rate registering 30%, the highest level of home price overvaluation in Georgia's history, which suggests that we could see prices potentially go down into the future, which is something that you better pay attention to if you're a home buyer or investor in Georgia's housing market in 2024, particularly if you're in an area like Atlanta or Macon or Savannah, or even some of the rural areas that I know are becoming more and more popular with people. I see quite a bit of risk in Georgia's housing market. However, for prices to decline in Georgia, we're going to need to see inventory go up by more into the future, because right now the inventory levels are fairly constrained compared to their long-term norms, with data on Reventure app showing that there's 29,000 homes for sale across Georgia's housing market today. This 29,000 homes for sale, it's up slightly year over year and is up significantly from the lows of the pandemic. However, it's still below the long-term average of 33,000 homes for sale. So as long as inventory is below the long-term average, we're unlikely to see prices crash. And there's a variety of reasons for why the inventory levels in Georgia are still low. Obviously, number one, lots of people moved to Georgia during the pandemic. Lots of refugees from states like New York and California moved in, and they bought up a lot of the homes, pushing the inventory levels down. Additionally, lots of existing owners across Georgia have locked in low 3 to 4% mortgage rates, and thus they're not as inclined to sell, particularly in a metro like Atlanta, where you can see the inventory levels are way down on the northern half of the metro. In these more expensive suburbs like Buckhead and Brookhaven, you can see inventory is down 34% from normal. There's a lack of listings, there's a shortage, which means more upward pressure on prices. And the way to think about this map is that the neighborhoods in blue, they're the ones that have the biggest inventory shortage, while the neighborhoods in red to the south of Atlanta actually have an excess of inventory as high as 58% more homes for sale than the long-term norms. And so as a result, what we're seeing in Atlanta and other parts of Georgia is what I call a bifurcated housing market, where there's certain neighborhoods, certain cities or parts of cities where, actually there's been a big surge in inventory, there's lots of sellers, the demand has gone down and prices are going down. Like unequivocally, certain areas are in a downturn, whereas other areas still have a shortage of inventory and prices are still going up. And it's so important for you as a home buyer and investor to understand where your city and your neighborhood falls on that spectrum, because that information is going to give you a lot of power and knowledge in knowing, how to make a better decision on home buying in 2024 and if prices are likely to go up or down into the future. But so far in this housing downturn, prices in Georgia, they've continued to go up in most areas, particularly on the southeast side of Georgia, everyone, where we're looking at the increase in home prices from the middle of 2022 over the last 18 months. We can see in Savannah, prices in Savannah are up 12% from the middle of 2022. The typical home value going from $283,000 to $318,000. Also in Hinesville, prices are up by 13%. This is really a pocket of strength in Georgia's housing market right now, Savannah, Hinesville, as well as Statesboro. Even if we go inland a bit, we can see Warner Robins prices are up 10%, Macon prices are up 7%, and the Atlanta metro, they're only up by 1%, with of course some big differences depending on where you look. We can also see in Athens, prices are up 5.8%, while in Dalton and Calhoun, prices are up 6 to 8%. And so the parts of Georgia that are strongest are the rural areas and the southeast, while Atlanta is kind of the weak spot, particularly the southern side of Atlanta. And let's just talk about Savannah for a second, because I know that's a metro and a housing market that I see more and more people interested in, and I get it. Savannah, I've been there. It's a charming town. The weather's good. Oh, it's a little humid in the summer. It's a college town. Also has like a vacation component. It's close to Hilton Head, South Carolina. It's got a lot of things going for it. And Savannah's appreciation since the middle of 2022, it's actually the second best in America. Savannah is the second best performing housing market since the middle of 2022, only trailing Fayetteville, North Carolina, and slightly better than Syracuse, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. So Savannah, it's a market to look at if you're a home buyer and investor. However, be careful, because prices there are starting to get overvalued compared to their long-term norms. With home prices in Savannah about 22% overvalued compared to their historical fundamentals. The typical price today is $318,000. The fair home value is $260,000. We can actually see that this level of overvaluation in Savannah isn't as bad as Atlanta. Atlanta's 33% overvalued, which suggests there could be some pretty big price downside if those inventory levels go up enough. And I just want to be clear, folks, this overvaluation metric, it's an important one for you to understand as a home buyer or investor, because historically in the housing market, one thing is very, very clear. When home prices go up above the level of income and they grow faster than the level of income, that's typically the sign of a bubble. And that's something that has happened in Georgia over the last 3 to 4 years, particularly in Atlanta. And so when the housing market is in that situation where the prices are higher than income, historically it means that there could be a lot of downside coming because the locals, they can no longer afford to buy the houses, right? And if the locals can no longer afford to buy the houses or qualify for the mortgage, then you're purely relying on inbound migration from other states, which I think was something that was definitely happening in Atlanta, during the pandemic. But at some point, that migration trend is going to slow. And when it does, the realities of how expensive home prices are for locals are going to come to pass. But right now, in the Atlanta metro, the typical home value of $372,000 is 4.2 times the median income of $88,000. Now, we could see that home value to income ratio of 4.2, it's the highest on record. And actually, over the last 20 years in Atlanta, on average, prices were only 3.2 times income. And so, we have 2 decades of data in Atlanta saying 3.2 times income is the norm. Now we're at 4.2, which suggests we're going to see the value to income ratio trend closer down to the long-term level, which can happen in one of 2 ways. Either prices can come down and or incomes will go up. Some combination of lower prices and higher incomes is needed to restore balance and equilibrium to the Atlanta housing market, as well as the housing market in much of Georgia. But once again, folks, this analysis on how overvalued home prices are and how much they could go down, it differs wildly by neighborhood. If we go back to Atlanta and we look at overvaluation by zip code, what do we see? We have some zip codes in Atlanta that are only 10% overvalued. We have other zip codes that are 90% or 58% overvalued. And so what you got to be careful of, folks, if you're buying in some of these areas in darker red, there's more risk of prices going down. Whereas if you're buying in some of these areas that are lighter in color, there's less of a risk of prices are going down. And particularly, I want to focus on some of these areas south of Atlanta because I have a lot of fear for what's going to happen in some of these neighborhoods like Forest Park and East Point and College Park and Riverdale. The prices here just spiked over the last several years during the pandemic, and I think they could be going down by quite a bit because these are areas that got crushed in the last housing downturn. Prices went down 60% in some of these neighborhoods, and the real problem in a lot of parts of Atlanta and Georgia is that investors came in and dominated these locations during the pandemic. There's some zip codes around Atlanta where investors bought 50% of the homes. And so if you have investors buying 50% of the homes for a couple years, that's something that could push prices just way up, right? But the problem comes in when the investor demand goes down. What happens to those zip codes and neighborhoods when investors are buying way fewer homes? I want you to look at this, everyone. Data from Redfin shows that investor purchases in Atlanta have plummeted. Investor purchases peaked in Atlanta around 13,000 homes a quarter back in 2021. That's now gone down by almost 70% to 3,700 homes a quarter. Fewer homes being purchased by investors in Atlanta now than even in 2017, way before the pandemic. And so the investors, they are kind of cutting the cord on buying in Atlanta, which means that a lot of those overvalued zip codes that they dominated, there could be big price downside. It explains why inventory has gone up in a lot of those zip codes. So if you're a home buyer, be very, very careful to know the profile of what's going on in your zip code. I don't think you want to be buying in some of these areas where the investors bought because the price declines, they could get pretty severe in 2024 and beyond. But folks, there's also another thing that I want you all to consider if you're a home buyer investor in Georgia. We've talked about inventory, we've talked about overvaluation, right? Those are really important metrics. But I also want you to consider the growth levels of the area that you're buying in. How much is the population growing? That's a really key metric to understand as well because, all other things the same, the more that the population is growing, the more support there's going to be for home prices into the future. The more people there will be to buy houses and rent apartments. And so you also really need to understand the population growth of the area you're buying in. And we can see the good news for Georgia is that it's had above average population growth over the last 5 years, 4.6% from 2017 to 2018. We can see that ranks number 13 of all the states in America. So Georgia is an above average population growth state. That's good for home values in the long run. But really, when we look by county, everyone, we can see there's big differences in population growth. So for instance, Forsyth County, north of Atlanta, 17% population growth over the last 5 years, one of the strongest growth rates of any larger county in America in Forsyth County. That's obviously good for home prices in the long run. But if we go to Fulton County or DeKalb County, really not much growth in population over the last 5 years, very little, 1%, 3%. Moreover, if we go further south in Georgia to some of these more rural counties towards the south, we can see actually huge losses in population, 12%, 11%, 20% declines in population. So you would definitely also want to be very careful buying in any type of area where population growth is going down, like in these areas in blue. We also see a huge level of population growth in the southeast part of the state. Some of these counties like Bryan County, 29% population growth, Buckingham County, 21% population growth. So all other things considered, you would feel a bit better, about your real estate decision buying in an area that has high growth. However, be careful. You also want to look at inventory levels and overvaluation rates, because those are telling you in real time what's going on in the market. And what I would encourage you guys to do, if you're a home buyer or investor in Georgia looking in 2024 or wanting to make a better decision, go to www.reventure.app right now and type in your city in Georgia, where you can immediately look at data for your neighborhood and zip code on trends in home values, home value growth, and inventory levels for free. You can look at different zip codes. You can also look at the different counties and really hone in and make a better home buying investment decision, particularly some of these premium data points like price cut percentage, sale inventory deficit, how high or low inventory is, and how over or undervalued home prices are. To access that premium data, sign up for a monthly pass at $39 a month. It gives you access to those premium data points. It is really going to help you make a better decision. Additionally, you could sign up for the annual pass at $399 and save 15% if you're someone who knows you're going to be researching this data for the next 3, 6, or 12 months. So head to www.reventure.app right now to make a more informed home buying and investment decision.